They thought silence meant fear. They were wrong. The Krell Dominion had conquered 47 star systems in 3 centuries, each victory announced with the same broadcast: surrender or be reduced to ash. When their fleet materialized at Earth's orbit, 300 warships glittering like knives against the void, they transmitted their ultimatum with the arrogance of gods. Admiral Thexva herself delivered the message, her 6 mandibles clicking in what passed for a smile among her kind. Earth had 72 hours to comply. In a cluttered apartment in Prague, Mira Kovač listened to the broadcast while eating leftover goulash straight from the pot. She set down her spoon, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and pulled her keyboard closer. The Krell had made a mistake. They'd assumed their quantum-encrypted communications were impenetrable. They'd never met someone who spoke the language of broken things. Mira had 3 days to prove that silence could be the loudest weapon of all. Mira's apartment smelled like burnt coffee and solder. 2 monitors flickered on her desk, one displaying the Krell ultimatum on loop, the other streaming defensive chatter from Earth's military command. Her tabby cat, Euler, sat on a pile of circuit boards, swishing his tail in irritation. The world outside her window was in chaos. Sirens wailed, news helicopters circled, and below on the street, people were loading cars and arguing about where to evacuate. Mira ignored all of it. She'd been a telecommunications engineer for 8 years before the government contract fell through. Now she freelanced, fixing satellite arrays and debugging encryption protocols for universities that couldn't afford better. Her mother called twice a week asking when she'd get a real job. Her friends had stopped inviting her out. But Mira understood something most people didn't. Every system had a flaw, and the Krell's ships hummed with electronic chatter she could hear if she listened the right way. The ultimatum repeated in 17 languages, each translation flawless. Admiral Thexva's voice was smooth, almost pleasant. Your resistance is noted and irrelevant. You possess no weapons that can penetrate our shields. You have no allies who will risk our wrath. Submit, and your species will be preserved as labor. Resist, and we will erase your cities one by one until compliance is achieved. Mira leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming on the armrest. The Krell had transmitted the message on a wide-spectrum frequency, piggybacking on Earth's own communication networks to ensure maximum reach. Efficient, arrogant, and sloppy because they'd left the channel open, a thin thread of carrier signal still linking their fleet to every device that had received the broadcast. She pulled up a secondary screen and started tracing the signal's architecture. The Krell used quantum-locked encryption, theoretically unbreakable because observation collapsed the key. But Mira had spent 6 months reverse engineering a prototype quantum relay for a defense contractor who'd never paid her. She still had the specs. She still had the exploit she'd found and never reported. Euler meowed, annoyed that she'd stopped petting him. Mira scratched behind his ears absently. They think they're so smart, she muttered. Bet they've never had to troubleshoot a firmware update on a 15-year-old satellite. Her phone buzzed, a message from her friend Lena, a microbiologist currently fleeing Berlin. Are you evacuating? Please say yes. Mira didn't reply. She opened a new terminal window and began writing code. The Krell fleet's communication network was a hive system, every ship synced to the flagship's core processor, updates and commands cascading down in real time. If she could find a way into that core, she could inject a virus that would propagate through the entire fleet. The problem was access. The Krell's firewalls were layered like an onion, each shell monitored by AI sentinels programmed to detect intrusion. A brute force attack would trigger countermeasures instantly. But Mira wasn't interested in brute force. She was interested in the Krell's one fundamental mistake. They designed their network assuming no one else in the galaxy understood quantum encryption. They'd never considered that a species they deemed primitive might have stumbled onto the same principles through sheer stubbornness and coffee-fueled spite. She spent the next 6 hours mapping the signal pathways, looking for the smallest crack. Her back ached. Her eyes burned. Euler knocked over a mug and she barely noticed. Outside, the sky began to lighten with false dawn, the glow of evacuation floodlights, not the sun. At 4:17 a.m. she found it. A microsecond delay in the handshake protocol between the flagship and the outer perimeter ships. The Krell were compensating for light speed lag manually, adjusting the sync rate every 30 seconds, which meant, for a fraction of a moment, the connection was vulnerable, a window so small it might as well not exist, unless you knew exactly when to look. Mira grinned. She pulled up the exploit code she'd shelved months ago and began modifying it, tailoring the payload to slip through that window like a whisper. It would take precision timing. It would take luck. But if it worked, the Krell wouldn't even know she was there until it was far too late. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a government alert. All citizens within 100 km of major cities must evacuate immediately. Mira swiped it away. She had 39 hours left. And she was just getting started. By noon, Mira's apartment had become a bunker. She'd closed the blinds, unplugged the fridge to reduce noise, and set up a secondary router running through a satellite uplink she'd jerry-rigged 2 years ago for a project that never launched. Euler had claimed the keyboard as a napping spot twice, and she'd gently relocated him both times. The evacuation sirens had stopped. The streets below were empty. The world felt like it was holding its breath. She worked in layers. First, she built a skeleton key, a piece of code designed to mimic the Krell's own authorization signatures. It wouldn't fool their AI for long, but it didn't need to. It just needed to buy her 3 seconds. 3 seconds to inject the payload. 3 seconds to become a ghost in their machine. The payload itself was elegant in its simplicity. It wasn't a destructive virus. It didn't delete files or corrupt data. Instead, it was a logic loop, a recursive function that would force every ship's navigation system to request confirmation from the flagship before executing any command. And the flagship, in turn, would request confirmation from every ship. An infinite loop of requests and verifications, each one exponentially increasing the processing load until the entire network ground to a halt. The Krell had built their fleet to be efficient. Mira was going to make it polite to the point of paralysis. She tested the skeleton key on a simulation she'd built from the signal traces. The first 3 attempts failed. The AI sentinels flagged the intrusion and locked her out. She adjusted the timing, shaving milliseconds off the handshake delay. The 4th attempt got further, but the payload triggered a checksum error. She rewrote the wrapper, disguising the code as a routine status update. The 5th attempt worked. Mira stared at her screen, watching the simulation collapse in on itself as the logic loop propagated. The flagship's processor spiked, then flatlined. The perimeter ships froze mid-maneuver. The entire fleet became a floating museum of expensive, useless metal. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Then she saved the code, backed it up to 3 separate drives, and started preparing for the real thing. At 2:00 p.m. her power flickered. Mira's stomach dropped. She sprinted to the window and looked out. The city was dark, not just her building, the entire district. Emergency lights glowed in the distance, but the grid had gone down, probably overloaded by the evacuation, or maybe the Krell had started softening up infrastructure. Either way, she had maybe 6 hours of battery backup. She returned to her desk and switched to her laptop, routing through the satellite uplink. The connection was slower, the latency higher, but it would have to do. Euler chirped from the windowsill, watching a bird that didn't realize the world was ending. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Lena. Mira, please. They're saying the Krell are going to start bombing tomorrow. Get out of the city. This time, Mira replied, I'm working on something. Trust me. Lena sent back 3 question marks and a string of angry emojis. Mira put the phone on silent. She spent the next 4 hours refining the delivery mechanism. The exploit had to be timed perfectly, injected during the narrow handshake window, wrapped in a legitimate-looking status update, and propagated before the AI sentinels could react. She wrote a script to automate the timing, syncing it to the Krell's own network clock. If she missed the window, she'd trigger an alarm. If she hit it, the fleet would go silent in less than a minute. At 6:00 p.m., she ran a final diagnostic. Everything checked out. The skeleton key was ready. The payload was armed. All she needed was the courage to press enter. Mira stood up, stretched, and made herself a cup of tea. Her hands were shaking. She'd spent her entire career fixing broken things, making systems work when they didn't want to. This was different. This wasn't about fixing something. This was about breaking it so thoroughly that it could never be repaired. She thought about her mother, who was probably in a bunker somewhere, praying. She thought about Lena driving west with a car full of lab equipment in fear. She thought about the millions of people who had no idea that a woman in Prague was about to bet the entire planet on a piece of code. Euler jumped onto her lap, purring. Mira scratched behind his ears and made a decision. She sat down, opened the terminal, and positioned her fingers over the keyboard. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Above them, 300 Krell warships waited, confident and cruel. Mira took a breath, checked the timer one last time, and pressed enter. The signal shot out into the void, invisible and unstoppable, a whisper that would soon become a scream. For 37 seconds, nothing happened. Mira watched the status bar crawl across her screen, each pixel an eternity. The satellite uplink hummed. Euler yawned. The city outside remained dark and silent. She refreshed the Krell frequency monitor, half expecting alarms, countermeasures, a retaliatory strike. Instead, she saw a single blip, a confirmation packet from the flagship. The skeleton key had worked. The payload was in. Then the Krell fleet went dark. It started with the perimeter ships. Their transponders flickered, stuttered, and flatlined. One by one, the warships stopped broadcasting. The Hive network, which had been a constant thrum of tactical chatter and status updates, collapsed into static. Mira pulled up a visual tracker, a third-party astronomy feed that someone had jury-rigged to monitor the fleet's position. The ships were still there, glittering in orbit like frozen fireflies, but they weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were ghosts. Mira leaned back in her chair, heart hammering. It had worked. The logic loop was propagating exactly as she designed, each ship requesting confirmation from the flagship requesting confirmation from the ships, an infinite recursion that choked their processors into silence. The Krell had built their fleet to be efficient, synchronized, unstoppable. She turned that efficiency into a trap. But the silence wouldn't last forever. The Krell weren't stupid. They'd realize what was happening. They'd initiate emergency protocols, isolate the infected systems, reboot the network. She had maybe an hour before they adapted, maybe less. Her phone lit up, not a text, but a call. Lena. Mira hesitated, then answered. "I'm okay," she said before Lena could speak. "The news is saying the fleet stopped transmitting," Lena said, breathless. Did you?" "Yeah." Silence on the other end, then, "Mira, what did you do?" "I'll explain later. I need you to do something for me." Mira pulled up a file directory, her fingers flying across the keys. "I'm sending you a code package, 3 redundant copies. If something happens to me, you need to get it to someone who can use it. A government lab, a university, I don't care. Just make sure it doesn't disappear." "Mira, you're scaring me." "Good, be scared, but also be ready." Mira hit send. Got it. Lena's voice was steadier now. "Are you going to be okay?" "I don't know," Mira said honestly. "But I'm going to try." She hung up and returned to her monitors. The Krell fleet was still silent, but the flagship's transponder was flickering, faint, erratic pulses like a dying heartbeat. They were trying to reboot. She needed to make sure they couldn't. Mira pulled up the exploit code and began writing a second payload. This one was simpler, a kill switch that would sever the flagship's connection to the rest of the fleet. If the Krell tried to bypass the logic loop by isolating the flagship, they'd lose command and control entirely. It was a gamble. If they managed to restore the network before she could deploy the kill switch, they'd lock her out for good. But if she deployed it too early, they'd detect the intrusion and adapt. Timing. Everything came down to timing. She checked the Krell frequency again. The static had shifted, developing a rhythm, short bursts like Morse code. They were trying to communicate manually, bypassing the automated systems. Smart, desperate. Mira smiled grimly. Desperation was good. Desperation made people sloppy. At 8:00 p.m., the flagship's transponder stabilized. Mira's stomach dropped. They'd rebooted. The logic loop was still running, but they'd isolated the core processor, cutting it off from the infected network. It was only a matter of time before they purged the virus and restored full functionality. She deployed the kill switch. The signal shot out faster this time. No skeleton key needed, no handshake delay. The kill switch was brute force, a sledgehammer where the exploit had been a scalpel. It hit the flagship's communication array and detonated, severing every connection in a cascade of corrupted packets. The transponder flickered once, twice, then went dark. Mira held her breath. The astronomy feed updated. The flagship was still there, still visible, but its running lights had gone out. The rest of the fleet remained frozen, a constellation of silent metal. She'd done it. She'd cut off the head of the snake. Her laptop battery was at 40%. Her hands were trembling. Euler meowed, demanding dinner. Mira stood up, legs unsteady, and stumbled to the kitchen. She opened a can of cat food, poured it into Euler's bowl, and sat on the floor while he ate. The enormity of what she'd done was starting to sink in. She just crippled an alien armada. Alone, with a laptop in spite, her phone buzzed. Not Lena this time. A government alert. Krell fleet communications have ceased. All citizens remain under evacuation orders until further notice. Mira laughed, a sharp, breathless sound. They had no idea. They thought the silence was a trick, a prelude to something worse. They didn't know the Krell were as blind as they were. At 10:00 p.m. the power came back on. The lights in her apartment flickered to life, harsh and sudden. Mira squinted, disoriented. The monitors rebooted and she checked the Krell frequency one last time. Still static, still silent. The fleet was a graveyard, but the silence wouldn't last. The Krell had backup systems, redundancies, failsafes. They'd send repair crews. They'd find a way to restore communication. Unless she gave them a reason not to. Mira opened a new file and began writing, not code this time, a message. Mira spent 3 hours crafting the message. It had to be perfect, not too aggressive, not too conciliatory. The Krell respected strength, but they also understood cost-benefit analysis. She needed to make them believe that continuing the invasion would be more trouble than it was worth. She needed to make them afraid. The message was simple. Your fleet is silent because we chose silence. We could have destroyed you. We didn't. Leave now and you'll keep your ships. Stay and we'll show you what else we can do. She translated it into the Krell's primary language using a linguistic database she'd pirated from a research university. The translation software was clunky, but it would do. The Krell would understand the threat. What mattered was whether they believed it. At 1:00 a.m., she hijacked the same wide-spectrum frequency the Krell had used for their ultimatum and transmitted the message. It shot out into orbit, bouncing off satellites, amplified by relay stations, loud enough that every ship in the fleet would receive it the moment they restored their systems. She added a second layer, an encrypted packet addressed directly to Admiral Thexva containing the exploit code signature. A calling card, proof that the silence hadn't been luck. Then she waited. The first response came at 3:00 a.m., not from the Krell, from Earth's military command. A priority alert pinged her laptop, demanding she identify herself and explain how she'd accessed restricted frequencies. Mira ignored it. 10 minutes later, someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find 2 soldiers in full tactical gear, a woman with a buzz cut and a man with a scar across his jaw. The woman held up a tablet displaying Mira's photo and ID. Mira Kovač, you're coming with us. Am I under arrest? That depends on what you've been doing for the last 12 hours. Mira grabbed her laptop and followed them out. They loaded her into an armored transport, and she spent the next hour staring out the window as they drove through empty streets toward a military airfield on the outskirts of Prague. Euler would be fine for a few days. She'd left him enough food, probably. The airfield was chaos, helicopters landing, officers shouting into radios, scientists huddled around monitors. The soldiers escorted her to a command tent where a general with steel-gray hair and the expression of a man who hadn't slept in days was waiting. He gestured to a chair. Mira sat. "I'm General Carvel," he said, "and you're going to tell me everything." Mira did. She explained the exploit, the logic loop, the kill switch. She showed him the code, the signal traces, the message she'd transmitted. Carvel listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back and rubbed his temples. "You realize," he said slowly, "that you just committed about 15 different acts of cyberterrorism against an alien fleet that was about to glass the planet," Mira said. "So yeah, I'll take the court-martial." Carvel laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're not getting court-martialed, you're getting a medal, assuming this works." He pulled up a live feed of the Krell fleet. The ships were still dark, but 3 smaller vessels, scout ships maybe, had detached from the formation and were drifting toward the outer perimeter. "They're moving, slowly. We think they're trying to establish line-of-sight communication with Earth. They want to negotiate," Mira said, "or they want to figure out who kicked their ass so they can kick back." At 6:00 a.m., the Krell transmitted a response. It came through the same frequency Mira had used, a single line of text in broken English. "Terms, Carvel looked at Mira. What do we tell them? Mira thought about the 300 warships still frozen in orbit. She thought about the 47 star systems the Krell had conquered. She thought about Admiral Thexva sitting in the dark on her crippled flagship, weighing the cost of pride against the cost of survival. Tell them they have 24 hours to leave Earth's orbit, Mira said. After that, we release the exploit code to every species in the galaxy. Let's see how long their empire lasts when everyone knows how to shut them down. Carvel grinned. I like you, Kovač. He turned to a communications officer. Send it. The officer hesitated. Sir, are we sure we want to threaten them if they call our bluff? It's not a bluff, Mira said. She pulled up her laptop and showed him the backup files she'd sent to Lena, plus 3 more she'd uploaded to anonymous servers scattered across the globe. The code's already out there, all I have to do is make it public. The officer sent the message. Mira watched the timestamp tick by, each second heavy with the weight of 300 warships and the fate of a planet. At 6:47 a.m., the Krell fleet began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, the ships pulling away from Earth's orbit in a synchronized retreat. The astronomy feed tracked them as they accelerated toward the edge of the solar system, their engines flaring to life for the first time in hours. At 7:00 a.m., the fleet jumped to faster-than-light travel and disappeared. The sky above Earth was empty again. Mira let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Carvel clapped her on the shoulder. You just saved the world, kid. I know, Mira said. Now can I go home? My cat's probably pissed. Mira returned to her apartment 3 days later. The government had wanted to keep her for debriefings, interviews, a press conference that she'd refused to attend. She'd given them the exploit code, walked them through the logic, and answered every question with the patience of someone who just wanted to sleep for a week. They'd offered her a job, chief consultant for the newly formed Planetary Defense Cybersecurity Division. She'd said she'd think about it. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Euler greeted her with an indignant yowl and a headbutt to the shin. Mira fed him, cleaned the litter box, and collapsed onto the couch. Her laptop sat on the coffee table, still open to the terminal window where she'd launched the kill switch. She closed it gently as if it might shatter. The world outside had started to rebuild. Evacuees were returning to the cities. News outlets were running stories about the silent victory, interviewing scientists and politicians who took credit for strategies they hadn't devised. Mira's name appeared in a few reports, an anonymous engineer whose quick thinking helped neutralize the threat, but no one had her photo. She preferred it that way. Lena visited on the 4th day, bringing groceries and a bottle of wine. They sat on the couch, Euler sprawled between them, and watched the sunset through the window. You're famous, Lena said. Sort of. I'm tired, Mira corrected. Are you going to take the job? Mira shrugged. Maybe if they let me work from home. Lena laughed. Only you would negotiate remote work after saving the planet. They drank the wine and talked about small things, Lena's lab, Euler's antics, a new cafe that had opened down the street. It felt normal, like the world hadn't almost ended, like silence hadn't been the loudest weapon of all. A week later, Mira received a package. No return address, no note. Inside was a small, smooth stone, black and glassy like obsidian, and a data chip. She plugged the chip into her laptop and found a single file, a video message from Admiral Thexva. The Krell Admiral sat in a dimly lit chamber, her mandibles still, her multifaceted eyes unreadable. Mira Kovač, she said, her voice translated into flat, mechanical English. You humiliated the Dominion. You exposed a weakness we did not know existed. For this, I should despise you. Thexva leaned forward. But I do not. You did what I would have done in your place. You protected your world with the tools you had. This is not weakness. This is strength. She paused. The Dominion will not return to Earth. Your species is inconvenient. But know this, you have made an enemy of empires who are not as forgiving as we are. They will come, and when they do, you will need more than silence. The video ended. Mira stared at the screen, then at the black stone in her hand. It was warm, almost alive, a warning, a gift, a promise. She set the stone on her desk next to Euler's favorite circuit board and opened a new file. If Thexva was right, if other empires were coming, then Earth needed more than luck. It needed defenses, systems. People who understood that every network had a flaw and every flaw could be exploited. Mira began writing, not code this time. A proposal, a blueprint for a planetary defense network that could adapt, evolve, and fight back against threats no one had imagined yet. She worked through the night, oiler purring on her lap, the city lights glittering below. Outside, the stars watched, indifferent and infinite. The Krell had demanded Earth's surrender. Mira had replied with silence. But silence, she was learning, was just the beginning. The real work, the hard work, was teaching the world how to listen. At 3:00 a.m., she sent the proposal to General Carvel with a simple subject line, "Let's get started." 3 weeks later, construction began on the first quantum relay station. 6 months after that, Mira stood in a brand new facility in Geneva, surrounded by engineers, linguists, and hackers from every continent, all working toward the same goal, making sure that the next time someone threatened Earth, they'd hear more than silence. They'd hear a world that had learned to fight back. Mira still lived in Prague, she still drank too much coffee. Euler still knocked over mugs, but now when she looked up at the night sky, she didn't see just stars, she saw possibilities, she saw defenses. She saw a future where Earth wasn't prey, and somewhere in the cold reaches of space, Admiral Thexva watched and wondered if she'd made a mistake.